This lecture review video examines the age of Jefferson. We can date this time period in American history from 1800 to 1824. Of course, Thomas Jefferson was not president for the entirety of these years, but his ideas and his influence extend so significantly during this time period that the first quarter of the 19th century in American history is sometimes designated the age of Jefferson. In 1800, there's a very consequential and somewhat dramatic presidential election in that year. Of course, in that year, John Adams, who has been president for one term, is running for re-election. He now clearly is the leader of the remaining Federalists, of the Federalist Party, and those that had supported the ideas of Alexander Hamilton and a stronger central government. But he is challenged now by the first political party in American history, the Democratic Republicans, founded by Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson had left Washington's administration as Secretary of State early, after only one term, out of frustrations with that administration, and now becomes the chief opposition to the Federalists who are in power in Washington and Adams. So in 1800, Thomas Jefferson, running as the representative of this new political party with Aaron Burr, indeed does receive the most electoral votes at 73 and beats out John Adams with his 65 electoral votes. However, this presidential election reveals something of a flaw in the United States Constitution, in the sense that Jefferson's running mate, Aaron Burr, also received 73 votes, thus resulting in a tie. And so, as a result, whenever there's a dispute in the Electoral College, the election is thrown into the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives at this time is split between Democratic Republicans, who would, of course, favor Jefferson, and many Federalists who are horrified at the prospect of having to decide between two Democratic Republicans, including their foe, Thomas Jefferson. And so there are numerous votes in the House of Representatives. And finally, in a great piece of irony, Alexander Hamilton, who was Jefferson's traditional enemy, instructs his Federalist followers to withhold their vote on the next ballot. And as a result, with the absence of the Federalists voting, it results in the Democratic Republicans electing Thomas Jefferson as president. So in a bit of irony, Alexander Hamilton plays the role of kingmaker here in making Jefferson president. Aaron Burr will serve for one term as his vice president. Here are the results of that election in the Electoral College. Thus, Thomas Jefferson, the lawyer from Virginia, who had composed the Declaration of Independence, who had been the governor of Virginia and also the U.S. ambassador to France for years during the Revolution and also the Constitutional Convention, the first Secretary of State, the founder of the University of Virginia and the author of the Religious Statute of Freedom in Virginia, and also the founder of the first political party in the United States, the Democratic Republicans, and John Adams, vice president, is now elected president. He will serve two terms from 1801 to 1809. A lot of scandal in the 1800 election, particularly centering around accusations that Thomas Jefferson had fathered several children through one of his African slaves, Sally Hemings. There is still great debate if indeed that did occur, but it was a very nasty election with a lot of mud slung both ways against both candidates. One of the prime accusations during the campaign of 1800 was that Jefferson, if elected, would initiate the Revolution of 1800. Usually when a candidate says we're going to bring about a revolution, he means that in a positive sense. This was, however, an insult by Jefferson's enemies, implying that Jefferson, who was highly disposed towards the very democratic but very violent revolution occurring in France and was very pro-French in his foreign policy, would bring the violence and the chaos, the instability, even the guillotine to the United States and initiate another revolution here against his enemies, sending them to the guillotine. So the title of Revolution of 1800 was actually a piece of slander. Jefferson, however, reassures the nation, his friends and supporters, as well as his critics and enemies alike, in his inaugural address, that he would not do such a thing in his administration. So the famous line from his first inaugural address is, "But every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We have called by different names brethren of the same principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists." And thus he emphasizes the unity of Americans. Perhaps one of the most significant contributions John Adams makes to United States history is that he leaves and gives up power peacefully. This is a peaceful transition of power from one political party to the next. The nation does not descend into civil war, conflict. There's no shooting or rioting in the streets. There's a peaceful transition of power from one party to the other. And that, of course, is the envy of the world in many other states. So Aaron Burr will indeed serve as Thomas Jefferson's vice president for his first term, but then be dropped from the ticket when Jefferson runs for re-election in 1804. Aaron Burr is a fellow New Yorker with Alexander Hamilton. They have a rivalry that goes back for a long period of time. And when Aaron Burr runs for governor of New York, Hamilton is very instrumental in a series of editorials in opposing him and digging up old slanders against him, impugning his character, which results in Burr's defeat in that gubernatorial election in New York. As a result, things come to a head between Burr and Hamilton on July 11th, 1804 at Weehawken, New Jersey, in which Burr challenges Hamilton to a duel. The two meet. It is unclear what happens. It is quite possible that Hamilton fires above Burr's head and intentionally misses him, but it is very clear that Burr fires and does not miss, shoots Hamilton, and as a result, he dies from his wounds. He is buried in the churchyard of Trinity Church in New York City today. Thus, a former vice president is responsible for the murder of a former secretary of the Treasury. And thus, Burr flees to the southwest, to areas of Tennessee and all the way down to New Orleans. We're not exactly sure what he was up to, but it seems that he was endeavoring to get the extreme western frontier, the extreme southwest frontier of the United States to secede from the larger country and perhaps make him president or some type of emperor. Eventually, Burr is charged for treason on this for these actions, but indeed he is exonerated and acquitted of the charges. A very significant Supreme Court case occurs in 1803. This is a very famous Marbury versus Madison case. In this case, John Adams, in the last days, perhaps last hours of his presidency, appointed several judges to the federal bench. His critics called these appointments midnight judges, as if John Adams was staying up all the way till midnight the night before the inauguration of his successor, Thomas Jefferson, and quickly filling the federal bench with all of these appointees who, of course, would hold to John Adams' Federalist sympathies. One of those judges appointed to the federal bench was William Marbury. William Marbury is appointed by John Adams. Then, very shortly after, Thomas Jefferson is inaugurated as the new president and appoints James Madison as the Secretary of State. James Madison, as Secretary of State, does not enforce or grant William Marbury his commission. Madison claims that that appointment was done in the previous administration and therefore wants more Democratic Republicans to serve on the federal bench and therefore denies Marbury his commission. Marbury therefore sues Madison, and the case makes its way all the way to the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court, which at this time is presided over by Chief Justice John Marshall, who ironically is also the cousin of Thomas Jefferson. Thus, Marshall has to decide which of these two plaintiffs before his court will he decide on behalf of. And so Marbury is faced with three important questions here. The first question that Marshall asks himself is, is Marbury entitled to his commission as a federal judge? He answers yes. He was legally appointed by John Adams when Adams was still president. Number two, can the Supreme Court enforce Marbury's commission? And Marshall responds, yes, the Judiciary Act empowers the court to enforce legal commissions. The key word there being enforce. The court has the power to enforce this commission. And the third question Marbury asks himself is, should the Supreme Court have the power to enforce a commission? And Marshall responds by saying, no, enforcement of the laws is a power granted to the executive branch. It is the responsibility of the executive branch and the president as the chief executive officer to enforce the laws of the land. And therefore, the Judiciary Act should have never given the Supreme Court the power to enforce a commission or a law. So therefore, it looks like Marshall is reducing the power of the Supreme Court when in reality he is dramatically expanding the powers of the Supreme Court by giving the power to declare a law of Congress unconstitutional to the Supreme Court. Therefore, Marshall decides that this part of the Judiciary Act of 1789 is declared unconstitutional. This greatly accentuates the power of the Supreme Court, and there are many other Supreme Court cases in American history that particularly stem from the Marbury v. Madison decision, in which for the first time the court decides whether or not a law of Congress is indeed constitutional or unconstitutional. Another significant event during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson are the Barbary Wars. The Barbary pirates were pirates on the North African coast, particularly centered around Libya and the city of Tripoli, and frequently merchant ships from all nations, but including American merchant ships, traveling through the Mediterranean would be attacked, raided, boarded by these pirates. Often American sailors were kidnapped and their goods were seized. Generally, the way that European powers dealt with this crisis was to pay the ransom to these pirates and then secure the release of their sailors. Jefferson, however, launches a war against the Barbary pirates, and after a group of American sailors are kidnapped and held aboard their own ship of the USS Philadelphia, it is Stephen Decatur who, in a secret night raid, attacks the Philadelphia, liberates the sailors, and then burns the Philadelphia to the waterline. As a result of the Barbary War, a new peace treaty is signed that ends these ransom payments to the pirates and protection for American merchant sailors through the Mediterranean. The most consequential event of the Jefferson presidency is, of course, the purchase of the Louisiana Territory. Important background to the purchase of Louisiana occurs with France itself. France, of course, at this time is reeling from the effects of the French Revolution and finally sees the emergence of an emperor after the travails of the French Revolution in Napoleon Bonaparte. Bonaparte, of course, is a brilliant military strategist and has conquered much of Europe at this time, with the particular notable exception of Great Britain. And so in order to continue his campaigns, Bonaparte certainly needs money and financing in order to keep an army in the field and to continue to keep his armies at bay. A significant event that is going to influence Napoleon's future decisions occurs on the French colony of Haiti. In 1791, lasting all the way until 1804, there's a large-scale slave revolt led by the very charismatic Toussaint Louverture. And these Haitian slaves rise up against their French masters, inflict great suffering, defeat them in battle, and massacre many of the French soldiers there. As a result, Haiti is no longer a French colony, a French possession. That is of key significance for the French, who, in their effort to control their possessions in the New World, really needed Haiti as a stopover point, as a key staging area for its control of the New World. In addition to these events, we need to understand the American right of deposit at the city of New Orleans. For American farmers in the Ohio River Valley and along the Mississippi, they would frequently grow their goods and then load them on barges and then float them south on the Mississippi to arrive at the port of New Orleans, which is a French city at this time. At New Orleans, the American farmers enjoyed the right of deposit, which was these large warehouses at New Orleans would stockpile and store American goods for a period of time until they were loaded onto ships and then sailed and sold to various American ports or ports in Europe or the Caribbean. It was a very important economic privilege the American farmers enjoyed. The French announce in the early 1800s that they are canceling this right of deposit, that Americans will no longer enjoy this privilege. This is going to have massive economic consequences for American farmers if they are denied this right. Therefore, President Jefferson sends two of his capable representatives and diplomats to go to France, and James Monroe and Robert Livingston. Their task is to purchase the city of New Orleans and perhaps the surrounding area, and they are given funds of up to $10 million. They are simply looking to purchase the city of New Orleans and the immediately surrounding area of the Mississippi River. They meet the very wily French foreign minister Charles Talleyrand. And Talleyrand, considering the fact that the French have just lost Haiti, and considering the fact that his boss, Emperor Napoleon, is always looking for more money to continue his military campaigns, makes the Americans an even more generous offer. He offers the sale of the entire French territory, sometimes called New France, the Louisiana Territory, to the Americans for the extremely low price of $15 million. The Americans are taken aback by the enormity and the generosity of this offer, and as a result come back and speak to the president about this offer to purchase this entire territory for the low price of $15 million, which will represent every acre for less than 3 cents. Now, there is a philosophical and constitutional conundrum that Jefferson faces here. Jefferson, in his long-standing debate with Alexander Hamilton, always styled himself as a strict constructionist, in the sense that the government can only do what is specifically empowered to do according to the Constitution. In fact, Jefferson historically railed against Hamilton, who always advocated loose constructionism, which was the idea that government can do whatever it wants to do as long as it's not prohibited by the Constitution. But of course, the Constitution states nothing about the president and the government buying land from a foreign power. So there is a conflict with Jefferson's principles here that he conveniently gets around with by, for the moment, adopting Hamilton's loose constructionism, in the sense that Jefferson and his supporters look at the Constitution and identify this clause in Article 2 regarding the executive branch, Section 2, that he, the president, shall have power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. So thus, Jefferson rationalizes this purchase as this indeed is a treaty. The president has the power to negotiate a treaty. The Senate will ratify the purchase of Louisiana, and therefore it's constitutional. That type of constitutional gamesmanship is the exact type of procedure that Jefferson would have railed against Hamilton for a decade or two before. But nevertheless, the purchase and the offer is so popular and so appealing that indeed the United States does buy the Louisiana Territory for the low price of $15 million. Of course, the question is, what exactly is in those lands? The United States is not really sure what it has purchased. And thus, Jefferson dispatches his very competent personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis, and a good friend of Lewis, an army captain, William Clark, to head west and to explore the new lands with a detachment of several dozen men known as the Corps of Discovery, usually nicknamed the Lewis and Clark Expedition. And so thus, the Lewis and Clark Expedition takes almost 2 years for them to depart from St. Louis and travel up the Missouri River. They try to travel by river as much as possible, and then connect with various smaller rivers and rivulets, including the Yellowstone and the Snake River, and then manage to get across the Rocky Mountains and then onto the Columbia River to actually reach the Pacific Ocean. Instrumental, of course, in their journey is the Shoshone woman Sacagawea, who acts as an interpreter, as a guide. And thus the Lewis and Clark expedition provides a lot of samples of animal, flora and fauna life, also information regarding the native tribes, the geography, and some of the first early accurate maps of the Western Territory of the United States. Zebulon Montgomery Pike is also another significant explorer who's going to move more to the southwest very early on. Pike's Peak in Colorado is named after him. Of course, the continual conflict between England and France, between Napoleon and the forces of Great Britain, continues to rage in Europe, and the United States cannot seem to extricate itself from this ongoing conflict. And so, because the English Navy and the French Navy continue this practice of boarding American ships on the high seas and impressing or kidnapping the American sailors into the British or French Navy as a great insult against the sovereignty of the United States, the American Congress and Jefferson signs the Embargo Act in 1807. This was an effort to punish England and France and all nations that would not respect the sovereignty of the United States. The Embargo Act ceased all trade between the United States and other foreign countries. Now, this theoretically synchronized with Jefferson's ideas about the ideal American being a yeoman farmer who is self-sufficient, self-sustaining. But of course, it did not really serve the merchant interests in America's larger cities along the Atlantic seaboard. And so as a result, this throws the United States into a very severe recession because of this law that is passed prohibiting all trade with other nations. Really realizing that the Embargo Act was too severe, later Congress is going to amend the Embargo Act and pass the Non-Intercourse Act, which prohibited American trade with just England and France. Trade could resume with the Dutch Republic and various European and South American states, but there would be no trade with England and France. Because the recession continues, eventually Congress replaces the Embargo Act and the Non-Intercourse Act with Macon's Bill No. 2 in 1810, which declared that whichever nation would stop impressing and declare that it would stop impressing American sailors, the United States would resume trade with only that nation, England or France. Of course, the French are smart enough to quickly declare they will stop impressing American sailors. Thus, the Americans resume trade with France and not England, even though the French are still continuing to impress American sailors on the high seas. All of this conflict over impressment and the European War, of course, will lead to American involvement in the War of 1812. Jefferson serves 2 terms in the White House and then, like Washington, returns to his favorite plantation of Monticello, which he continues to build and expand the rest of his life, and then dies on July 4th, 1826, along with John Adams. His legacy is, of course, commemorated with the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. Thomas Jefferson is followed by his loyal lieutenant and philosophical equal, James Madison, also resident of Virginia, Orange County, Virginia. He attended the College of New Jersey and studied under the Presbyterian minister John Witherspoon during his time at the College of New Jersey, which eventually becomes Princeton. He, of course, is also known as the father of the American Constitution because he brings a draft to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. He is also the author of the American Bill of Rights. He also served as the Secretary of State during Jefferson's term as president. So Madison is elected in 1808. He will serve from 1809, 2 terms until 1817. He is aided by his very friendly and charismatic wife, Dolly Madison. Some would consider Dolly to be really the first lady because she really expands the role for social causes and also acts as a very important hostess in the White House. At the beginning of Madison's term, it is clear that a new generation has been elected to the United States Congress. These new generation of young Democratic Republicans, many of them from the West, but not exclusively, become known as the War Hawks. This generation has heard about their grandfather or their father's exploits in the American Revolution and about how their grandfathers and fathers had defeated the mighty British Army during the Revolution and secured independence for the United States. Frankly, they're tired of hearing those stories and are eager to prove their own military mettle as well with another conflict against Great Britain. 3 key leaders of the War Hawks will become 3 key leaders in the Congress throughout the antebellum period, this time period that leads all the way to the eve of the American Civil War. These 3 key leaders, sometimes called the Great Triumvirate, not only serve as war hawks, come into Congress at all about roughly the same time, will also become the prime leaders of sectionalism during the antebellum period because they each come from a different section of the country and will represent that section's interests all the way up to the Civil War. All 3 will serve in government. All 3 will become significant senators from their respective states and represent their areas. All 3 will serve in an administration, a presidential administration. All 3 will aspire to the presidency, but all 3 will fail in their attempts to win the presidency. All 3 will die before the Civil War and their efforts to prevent that war. Definitely one of the most significant leaders in Congress is elected in 1810. This is Henry Clay, elected as one of the youngest speakers of the House ever. A young Democratic Republican from the state of Kentucky who will hammer out 3 significant compromises which will delay the coming of the American Civil War. Henry Clay will run for president 3 times and fail, of course, in all 3 of those bids. John C. Calhoun, representative and then later senator from South Carolina. He will also serve as vice president under President Andrew Jackson, and he will become the most vocal member of the South, advocating for Southern interests, defending Southern lifestyles, Southern states' rights, and also the institution of slavery. And Daniel Webster from Massachusetts, who is probably the greatest orator of the age, will deliver impassioned speeches on the floor of the Congress for the continuance of the Union and the abolition of slavery. To the West, after the American Revolution and into the early 19th century, the continual conflict for American settlers remains with native tribes. Of course, from the terms of the Peace of Paris of 1783, securing American independence, the United States owns all the land to the Mississippi River. The purchase of Louisiana territory expands that territory even more. But these lands are full of native tribes that have continually been pushed back from the east as American settlers continue to move west and farm new lands. It is therefore a very significant Shawnee Indian known as Tecumseh, who forms a very powerful confederacy in the Ohio River Valley, aided by his brother, nicknamed the Prophet, Tenskwatawa. Tecumseh's confederacy serves as a military obstacle for the continual settlement of American farmers. Thus, the American army moves into the Ohio River Valley and engages Tecumseh's Confederacy along the banks of the Tippecanoe Creek in modern-day Indiana at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811. The American forces are under the command of General William Henry Harrison, and in this very significant engagement, Harrison's army forces defeats Tecumseh's Confederacy. It breaks the backbone of Indian resistance in the Ohio River Valley with this defeat of Tecumseh. That's going to be an important event leading to the War of 1812 between the United States and the British. Other significant event continues to remain this issue of impressment, in which the British Navy, which is the largest and most powerful in the world, because of the very harsh discipline that occurs in the British Navy and the often lack of supplies and the long periods of time at sea and the continual warfare, the British Navy is constantly subject to deserters, sailors leaving their ships once they land at port. And so the British Navy is always looking for additional sailors to be impressed into its ranks. And thus, the British launched this policy of stopping American vessels who they have little respect for, sending in boarding parties, and then seizing American citizens, American sailors, claiming that they were British deserters. and then they are impressed, kidnapped, forced to go onto the British ship where they were to continue for the remainder of their lives. Needless to say, this is a great insult against American sovereignty. Also will be an issue leading to war. The most egregious episode of impressment takes place between the USS Chesapeake and His Majesty's ship, the Leopard, in 1807, in which the Chesapeake refuses to stop and be boarded by the Leopard. The Leopard opened fires, destroys the main mast of the Chesapeake, sends on a boarding party, and then impresses several of its sailors aboard the Leopard. Thus, war breaks out between the United States and Great Britain in this year of 1812. This is the War of 1812, which will last until 1815. We can identify the causes of this war as being these Indian wars to the west, because these Indian confederacies, such as Tecumseh, are often financed and certainly supplied with rifles from the British themselves. The continual issue of impressment is certainly a cause of the War of 1812. The agitation of the war hawks itching for war with Great Britain to prove themselves is also a cause of the war. A growing sense of nationalism among the Americans to prove themselves as a sovereign, independent nation, and also this land hunger for these lands west and perhaps even lands to the north in Canada are all significant causes of the War of 1812. This war is going to be full of ironies, including the fact that many of the causes leading to war are actually really resolved by the time that hostilities actually break out. It is also ironic for the fact that the largest battle of the war will occur after the peace treaty is signed. And also ironic is that the peace treaty itself in many ways doesn't really resolve a lot of the causes of the war, but is similar to the Peace of Paris that ended the American Revolutionary War, that essentially reflects a great desire for British merchants to go back to trading with the Americans and resume that profitable trade. We can divide the War of 1812 into three theaters very similar to the American Revolution. We can identify a war in the north, which was particularly centered around the Great Lakes, with several points of attack by the Americans endeavoring to invade British Canada and their possessions there, all of which fail, and then a response of British forces to move against American possessions and, in a sense, invade the United States, all of which also fail, with pivotal battles on the Battle of Lake Erie, with Commander Oliver Hazard Perry assembling very quickly a fleet on Lake Erie, meeting the British with his famous lines of "Don't give up the ship," and "We have met the enemy, and they are ours," and also Thomas MacDonough's victory on Lake Champlain, known as the Battle of Plattsburgh, which also thwarted a British invasion. This is the war in the north. The war in the center does not go as well for the Americans, because the British, after it seems that there is peace in Europe and a final defeat of Napoleon, are able to send more troops to the United States to prosecute this war. So they land a large force right in the Chesapeake Bay and begin their march on the American capital right towards Washington, D.C. In command of the British forces here is Sir George Cockburn. And with great ease, he more or less brushes aside the small militia units that come out to match his very large, trained, and experienced army and continues his march all the way to Washington, D.C. He's also aided with one of the more advanced weapons of the day, which were concrete rockets that he could launch against American militia forces. And thus, he arrives in Washington, D.C., facing little resistance with the federal buildings in his sight. A few hours previous to this, Dolly Madison had given orders to clear the White House of some of its most valuable possessions, including this famous portrait of George Washington. They are therefore removed by cart from the White House, and then the British set to burning the city of Washington, particularly with its main government buildings, including the White House, also the Capitol, the Patent Office, and other significant government buildings as well. What remains, of course, is that the White House is burned down to its sandstone shell, and then after the war, the White House will be rebuilt and the executive mansion is now officially designated the White House, as for the first time it is indeed painted white after this burning. After burning Washington, D.C., Cockburn and his British army proceed north and go up the Chesapeake and then set their sights on Baltimore and the destruction of Baltimore. But in their way, in the harbor, is Fort McHenry. And so, Fort McHenry, which stands for the defense of the city of Baltimore and downtown Baltimore, is shelled on the nights of September 13 and 14 by the British ships in Baltimore Harbor. They continue to shell the harbor throughout the night, and there's, of course, this very famous flag standing above the harbor. On board one of the British ships is a local lawyer named Francis Scott Key. Francis Scott Key was on one of those British ships endeavoring to negotiate the release of one of his friends who is a prisoner on the British ship. While he's negotiating the release, throughout the night, he is watching Fort McHenry being bombarded. And he sees the bombs bursting in the air and the rockets' red glare, and of course famously composes a poem, The Star-Spangled Banner, which celebrates this event, and of course later in 1931 is signed into law by President Herbert Hoover as the national anthem of the United States. Conflict in the middle theater of the war during the War of 1812 also occurs on the high seas between the USS Constitution versus the HMS Guerrière. The Constitution is commanded by Captain Isaac Hull, and during this engagement off the coast of Newfoundland, at one point the Constitution, whose sides were made of 4 layers of dried green oak, very thick, very dense, one of the sailors identifies that the cannonballs of the Guerrière are bouncing off the side of the Constitution and not penetrating the hull, and yells, "Huzzah, her sides are made of iron." So as a result, the Constitution earns the nickname of Old Ironsides. The Constitution is, of course, restored for many years. It remains in Charlestown Harbor today in Boston, and it remains the oldest commissioned active naval ship in the United States Navy. During the War of 1812, because the war affects the area of New England, particularly in a negative light, many congressional representatives from New England had not even voted for a declaration of war against Great Britain. Members of the New England congressional delegation convene in the Connecticut city of Hartford and hold a convention. They are unhappy how New England is negatively affected, particularly economically, from the War of 1812. They never wanted this war. They feel that their influence on the national scene is waning with the election of these presidents from Virginia, particularly Democratic Republicans, where New England remains a Federalist stronghold. So as a result, they convene at Hartford in 1814 at the Hartford Convention. And at Hartford, they propose numerous constitutional referendums, items for reform, to change the Constitution. Now, of course, the United States Constitution provides for the fact that there can be amendments to the Constitution. And so the members of the Hartford Convention are simply proposing amendments that could be adopted to change the Constitution, including new states requiring a 2/3 vote before admission to the Union, no embargoes that last over 60 days, trade regulations would require not a majority but a 2/3 vote of Congress, a declaration of war must require a 2/3 vote, naturalized citizens cannot be elected to Congress, and there should be single term limits for president instead of these double terms that keep occurring for presidents from Virginia, and that no president from the same state could be elected for 2 successive terms. Now, to be sure, these are Federalist ideas that are clearly targeting the Democratic Republicans who are growing in numbers in those western states, growing in numbers through immigration, and their national influence is particularly acute with the election to 2 terms of Jefferson and also Madison, and then to be followed by Monroe as well. These are certainly Federalist ideas, but there is no treason here. This is simply recommendations to provide amendments to the Constitution. There are a few muted voices at Hartford who call for secession, states to actually leave the Union, but those are very radical, very few, and they are quickly squelched. However, the Hartford Convention has this reputation of being a treasonous convention and not being supportive and sufficiently nationalistic and patriotically supporting the War of 1812 and the Democratic Republicans who are running the war. That becomes particularly clear when the war shifts to the South. The war shifts to the South, particularly under the command of Andrew Jackson. The war in the South is also an Indian war, with Jackson's defeat of the Creeks in the Creek War, particularly the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, which results in the Treaty of Fort Jackson, with the Creek Confederacy ceding large areas of land in Alabama and Georgia to the United States for additional American settlement. The British take advantage of these events in the South and land a large army in Georgia, and then also move against the pivotal ports of Pensacola and also New Orleans. Jackson's forces move continually west, blocking a British invasion at Pensacola, and then meet a very large contingent of British soldiers at the Battle of New Orleans in January of 1815. Taking up a strategic position behind a large earthwork, the British launch a head-on attack against a dug-in, elevated position at the Battle of Chalmette Field, and as a result, the British are soundly defeated in a major American victory under the command of Jackson. British casualties are over 2,000, and American casualties are only about 300. The irony here is that with the news of America's greatest victory comes the news that a peace treaty had already been signed a few weeks earlier on Christmas Eve, the year before, at Ghent in Belgium. This treaty is negotiated, but of course word of the treaty takes some time to get back across the Atlantic and get to these very remote southern forces. And so in the Treaty of Ghent, negotiated by John Quincy Adams and the Secretary of Treasury Albert Gallatin, Henry Clay, and James Bayard, we have the terms: America abandons its demands for a renunciation of impressment in the cession of Canada. So in other words, it's not going to resolve the issue of impressment, but impressment's no longer an issue because finally Napoleon is defeated and the European wars will end. The British renounced their demands for an Indian buffer state, made other minor territorial concessions, which they had already promised anyway, and an armistice ends the fighting. Conquered territories are returned. More than anything, what we see with the Treaty of Ghent is a desire to get back to a healthy trade between the United States and Great Britain, to resume economic prosperity. And as news of the peace treaty and news of the victory of American victory at New Orleans is reaching Washington, D.C., representatives of the Hartford Convention are also arriving in Washington, D.C. And so these malcontents from the Hartford Convention seem to be treasonous amidst all this patriotic celebration of victory of the Battle of New Orleans and the end of the war. The Hartford Convention really represents the last gasp of the Federalist Party, and it really will mean their death knell, that they will no longer even exist as a party only a few years later. As a measure of goodwill between the United States and Great Britain, and as evidence that no one really wanted this war, and in the end, the war was really about resuming a healthy trade between England and the United States, in 1818, the Senate ratifies the Rush-Bagot Treaty. The Rush-Bagot Treaty created the largest disarmed border in the world between the United States and British Canada, the longest unfortified boundary in the world at 5,527 miles. That remains the case until today. James Madison's terms end after 2 terms in the White House, and then Madison is followed by another Virginian in James Monroe. James Monroe, like Washington and Jefferson and Madison before him, also from Virginia, had studied at the College of William and Mary. Monroe had served as the United States Senator, a governor of Virginia. He has served as Secretary of State, also Secretary of War at the same time at one point in Madison's administration. And so he is one of the most experienced government officials to ever be elected to the presidency in 1816. He too will serve 2 terms. He was also a wounded veteran of the American Revolution, and therefore his credibility as an elected official was extensive. He had a long resume when he was elected in 1816. With the ascension of Monroe to the presidency, we can definitely mark a change in the landscape of American political parties. Whereas George Washington really was not part of a political party. In fact, you remember in his farewell address, he warned against political factions or parties. He certainly had Federalist sympathies. He supported the federal Constitution and a lot of Hamilton's ideas. John Adams was more inclined to identify himself as a Federalist when he served his 1 term as president. And of course, Thomas Jefferson had created the Democratic Republicans as a loyal opposition party to Federalist ideas and Federalist centralization of government power, and had created the Democratic Republicans. He, of course, is elected to 2 terms. And then his fellow Virginian, James Madison, was elected to 2 terms, and now James Monroe is also elected to 2 terms. As a result, with the death of the Federalist Party, particularly stemming from what seemed to be disloyal at the Hartford Convention, there is only one political party now in the United States called the Democratic Republicans. So therefore, with the election of Monroe, sometimes this time period is called the era of good feelings. The good feelings, of course, being that there is not political rivalry and political conflict between 2 political parties. However, we should not completely see this time period as a period where goodwill completely dominates. There are divisions within the Democratic Republicans itself. In fact, a lot of former Federalists migrate to the Democratic Republicans and bring their much more nationalistic ideas to the party. So what eventually we will see is these Democratic Republicans again divide into the historic division of American politics based on this question of how big should the power of the central government be. In Florida, we have an emerging conflict between the local tribes and American forces. The area of Florida, of course, is still a Spanish possession. However, the Spanish pay little attention to it. There's only a small garrison there, and the Indian tribes far outnumber Spanish settlers on the peninsula of Florida. And frequently, these Indian tribes will cross over the border in the United States into Georgia and into Alabama, attacking American settlements. In response to this, General Andrew Jackson, still in the Southern Theater after his victory at the Battle of New Orleans, sends in a detachment into the Florida Panhandle, and at St. Mark's in Pensacola, executes 2 Indian chiefs and even 2 British subjects in Spanish Florida. Needless to say, this is an international outrage that Jackson and the American army has crossed over into a foreign possession and instituted his own military justice. There's outrage on behalf of the British, but also particularly among the Spanish. Many in Monroe's cabinet call for the court-martialing of Andrew Jackson and him being stripped of his command. However, the Secretary of State, very wise, well-trained, educated, and brilliant, John Quincy Adams, holds a minority opinion that the United States ought to contact Spain and demand the sale of Florida because of their inability to control the Indians and guard its borders. And indeed, Spain, desperate for money, is willing to agree to this proposal, and therefore Spain ceded Florida to the United States for $5 million in the Adams-Onis Treaty. Also, the border between the United States and Spain is established in North America, and the United States promised not to make any claims in the area of the Texas territory of New Spain. Now, of course, the United States gains Florida as a new territory, which will become a state in the 1840s. But this promise not to make any claims to the area of Texas, of course, will become null and void once Mexico declares its independence from Spain. And thus, Americans will move into the area of Texas, feeling that they're not in violation of the Adams-Onis Treaty, because that was a promise and a treaty made to Spain, and now Mexico controls the Texas area. So thus, for $5 million, the United States secures the purchase of Florida. Jackson's incursion into Florida is the first of several conflicts of the long-standing conflict between the United States and the Seminole Wars on the Florida Peninsula. His incursion is sometimes known as the First Seminole War. The Second Seminole War breaks out with a very violent massacre of an American Army battalion in Bushnell, Florida, known as the Dade Massacre, in which almost 100 soldiers are massacred at this site in Sumter County, Florida. As a result, additional troops are sent to Fort King in Ocala, Florida, for the defense of the region. A very embarrassing and ignoble episode occurs during the war when Chief Osceola, who's the chief of some of these Seminole tribes, begins a negotiation with American forces under a flag of truce. But the American soldiers violate the flag of truce and indeed kidnap and imprison Osceola. Without their commander, the Seminole proved to be rather disorganized. They flee to the swamps of South Florida, particularly around the Everglades, which is going to lead to additional conflict that isn't going to be abandoned until 1858, with the American Army now focused more on the impending Civil War. Also during the presidency of James Monroe, we have the rechartering of another Bank of the United States. You remember that Hamilton had pushed for the creation of the First National Bank. That First National Bank had a 20-year charter of 1791 all the way to 1811. With the coming of the War of 1812, that charter had not been renewed. As a result, with a lot of financial stresses after the War of 1812, a new second Bank of the United States, this time created by the very same Democratic Republicans who opposed Hamilton's Bank of the United States, is chartered in 1816. The charter was supposed to last until 1836. Of course, the role of the National Bank is to collect those tariff revenues, turnpike tolls, and customs duties, deposit those monies into this federal bank. The federal bank would also oversee pet banks, sometimes called wildcat banks, for their proclivity to print money without having the necessary gold or silver to back it up. The Second Bank of the United States would make sure they would have the appropriate hard money or specie, gold and silver, to print that money and then loan to farmers. So it regulated the nation's banking and money supply. It is clear that the economy is in rough shape after the War of 1812 because we have a very significant, severe, deep panic of 1819, where a lot of farmers lose their lands, a lot of these small banks close, and thus revealing the necessity of a strong central bank to regulate the money supply. In 1819, with so many American settlers heading west, particularly along the Ohio River Valley, they settle the area that will become the state of Missouri. With enough settlers, in accordance with the Northwest Ordinances, the people of the territory of Missouri apply for statehood. However, in that area, a lot of these settlers in the area of Missouri to the west of the Mississippi are slaveholders. And so as a result, James Tallmadge, a northern congressman, proposes that the bill to admit Missouri to the Union would include an amendment, known as the Tallmadge Amendment, which would prohibit slavery in Missouri. In fact, those who were slaves already there, over time, at a certain age, would be manumitted or emancipated. However, the Southern Congressional Delegation opposes the Tallmadge Amendment, prohibiting Missouri from becoming a state. Thus, the territory of Missouri and its inhabitants remain in limbo for several months, not able to gain statehood. It is finally a senator from Kentucky, Henry Clay, who steps in and proposes his first of three significant compromises during the antebellum period. This is the Missouri Compromise. in which Missouri will be admitted to the Union as a slave state. But Maine will be carved out, this territory, as part of the northern state of Massachusetts, will be carved out and create an independent state, which will be a free state. Thus, the admission of Maine as a free state and the admission of Missouri as a slave state will provide that sectional balance, an equal number of votes between free and slave states in the United States Senate. Clay also proposes that henceforth the issue of slavery will be resolved in the Louisiana Territory along the latitude line of 3630, Missouri Compromise. So what we could say is that clearly there are emerging sectional differences after the War of 1812. It is clear that more and more Americans start to think of themselves think of themselves as a Northerner, or think of themselves as a Southerner or as a Westerner, and not as an American. And that is reflected particularly with the issue of slavery, which will exacerbate the entire situation. To the south of the United States, there is a recurring number of independence movements occurring in the old Spanish Empire. Spain, which has been in decline for over 200 years, is gradually seeing these former possessions that they had created during the Age of Discovery declare their independence. They are aided, many of these states are aided, including Colombia and Venezuela, through the charismatic leadership of Simón Bolívar, who is known as the Great Liberator, defeating Spanish forces, and the South American republics are declaring their independence. There's great talk in Europe, particularly among the Spanish, of using their military forces to come and suppress these rebellions and to shut down these republics and restore the Spanish Empire. However, the United States and the Monroe administration is very concerned about large European forces invading countries to their south, and thus they issued the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, also written by John Quincy Adams. The Monroe Doctrine asserted that henceforth the Americas are closed to further colonization. The United States will recognize all existing colonies that remain for the Europeans, but Europe should not interfere with any government in the Americas, including these new republics. And the United States promises not to meddle into European affairs. Thus, the Monroe Doctrine becomes the guiding principle for U.S.-Latin American relations for over 100 years. It will be amended, particularly during the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, and then eventually it will be revoked by the good neighbor policy of Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s. Also significant during the Monroe presidency, despite the fact that Democratic Republicans have succeeded in achieving the abolition of the Federalist Party, and that really Democratic Republicans exclusively control Congress in this so-called era of good feelings, ironically, the other branch of government, namely the federal courts, are really dominated by now the extinct Federalist Party, because there's many Federalist judges who had been appointed there, and the Supreme Court itself is presided over by the Chief Justice, who has strong Federalist sympathy. So what we see in the Marshall Court during John Marshall's time presiding over the court is a series of decisions that clearly favor federal power over state power. That's the prevailing theme of the Marshall Court, prevailing federal power over state power. Thus, we've already seen this in the Marbury versus Madison decision, which established the judicial review of laws. The Supreme Court can declare a law unconstitutional. Also, Dartmouth College versus Woodward, state legislators cannot violate charters and contracts. McCulloch versus Maryland, very important case in which the state of Maryland endeavored to tax the Bank of the United States. Marshall ruled against the state, declaring that the National Bank is a federal institution and cannot be taxed by a state legislature. Also, Gibbons versus Ogden of 1824, in which Congress, not individual states, would regulate interstate commerce. With these emerging sectional differences during the era of good feelings, we also see one of the most significant debates on the floor of the United States Senate in 1830. This is the Webster-Hayne debate between Daniel Webster and also Senator Robert Hayne of South Carolina. And the crux of this debate was particularly over the issue of secession and nullification. Can a state nullify a law? Can a state declare that a law is null and void in its own area and doesn't apply? Hayne asserted that a state could, and Webster asserted the fact that a state definitely could not do that. In fact, the doctrine of nullification would create the Union to be a rope of sand, was Webster's famous line from this debate. We can conclude our discussion of the age of Jefferson by a look at the American economy during this time period. Two significant revolutions, we could call them, occur in the American economy. One is the transportation revolution, the other is the market revolution. And of course, the transportation revolution is going to make the market revolution possible. By a transportation revolution, we mean a change in speeds and types of transportation across the country. And by the market revolution, we mean the movement from a local economy to a national economy, even international economy. So American farmers, for the first time, and small manufacturers begin to think of themselves as selling not just to their local consumers, but also to those across the country and even across the world. So to feed the market revolution, there's a significant transportation revolution across the country with the construction of canals and roads and turnpikes that begin to connect the country. Much of this construction is done with a large wave of new immigration, particularly originating from Ireland and Germany. The Irish were known for being hard workers, particularly on early railroads and diggers of canals and builders of roads. And they settled primarily in northern cities with large Irish populations in Boston and New York, and then fan out across the Midwest, assisting in the construction of a lot of these new transportation mediums. We also see a large number of Germans immigrate to the United States. Many of them particularly settle in New York and Pennsylvania and also the Midwest, very eager for cheap farming land. There's also a backlash against this new wave of immigration, the first backlash against immigration in the United States, known as the American Party, often nicknamed the Know-Nothing Party. For when their critics asked them about their party, they claimed that they knew nothing, and so their critics called them the Know-Nothing Party, even though they are primarily an anti-immigrant party, often labeling the German and Irish immigrants as drunks and lazy and not symmetrical to the existing American population. Far out to the west, the Rocky Mountains do witness some settlers or travelers in those areas known as the Mountain Men. The Mountain Men were fur trappers looking for the very valuable beaver pelts in the Rocky Mountains. This is very lonely, very isolated, very dangerous work. But an individual who could secure pelts despite Indian attacks, the very harsh conditions, and the immense loneliness and lack of supplies and an enormous competition between pelters, could stand to achieve a very large profit. Of course, the dangers are immense, including the very famous case of Hugh Glass, who is mauled by a bear in the middle of what is today South Dakota and somehow manages to travel 200 miles despite enormous injuries all the way back to an army fort after this mauling. John Jacob Astor is one of the more famous merchants to earn a fortune from mountain men and pelts in the Rocky Mountains. In order to tie the country together, Senator Clay formed what is known as the American System. In this very large bill, he proposes internal improvements, by which he meant roads, canals, and railroads. Also, a new protective tariff, which would be a tax on imports, protecting American goods, encouraging people to buy American goods, and also the rechartering of the bank. Each area stood to gain something from these areas, whether through new transportation networks or also access to port cities, new trade, and so it becomes a very popular bill and is going to catapult Clay to a new national importance. So, of course, throughout the colonial period, the great challenge for Americans to move across their country is the lack of adequate roads. So in the early antebellum period, we see a flurry of road construction, turnpikes, tolled roads, new gravel bases that prevent them from being washed out. The first nationally constructed road and federally financed is from Cumberland, Virginia, all the way to Cumberland, Maryland, all the way to Vandalia, Illinois, with important stops along the way, and very instrumental in making cities such as Columbus, Ohio, and also Indianapolis, Indiana, as important stops along the way. Also, this is the great age of canal construction, with canals connecting smaller rivulets to larger rivers, to larger lakes, and of course, eventually the ocean, the most famous of which is the Erie Canal, which is in a very strategic position of connecting the Hudson River and Mohawk River to smaller rivers in upstate New York and lakes, all the way to the Niagara River and Lake Erie. Thus, goods that are produced in the Ohio River Valley could be floated across the Great Lakes to the Niagara River, then be connected by the Erie Canal all the way to the Mohawk, then to the Hudson, then New York City, and then to ports all around the world. These canals are very simple. They're very shallow. They're simply for floating barges. Some of the more advanced ones, including the Erie Canal, contain locks, which are these elevators that could lift a boat by inflating the various locks and moving them to the next stage of the river. Also important in water transportation is Robert Fulton's invention of the steamboat, in which he took James Watt's invention of the steam engine and simply placed it on a boat, creating the Claremont, which demonstrated its success by going against the current on the Hudson River in the early 1800s. This will also lead to the great age of steamboats, paddle boats, which will become so important for trade along the Mississippi River. Railroads come later and are indeed an English and Scottish invention, and gradually the locomotive power placed on a steam engine on top of a carriage is stronger and larger, able to pull larger freight loads and passengers across the country. Thus, we can see that the travel times in 1800, whereas it took one day to move from New York to just the eastern side of New Jersey or Pennsylvania, 30 years later, one day's travel from New York could get someone deeper into Pennsylvania and well past New Jersey. And then by 1857, on the eve of the Civil War, one day's travel, particularly by the railroad from New York, could get an individual all the way out to Illinois. We also see a burgeoning manufacturing industry occurring in early 19th century America. The great irony is, despite the death of Hamilton and the death of his political party of the Federalists and the triumph of the Democratic Republicans, it really is Hamilton's vision of a national bank, a strong central government, and a manufacturing base that triumphs in the history of the United States. We see that with cottage industries, in which originally all products were produced in the home, and then gradually we see that part of them are produced in mills, and then others products are finished in the home. We see the development of mills across the country, powered by water power, and then gradually these mills are expanded into larger factories with larger workforces and larger, more complex machines. We can identify one of the first mills in the United States to be Slater's Mill in Rhode Island on the banks of the Patuxent River. Samuel Slater was an Englishman who had worked in the industrial factories of England, and he had illegally memorized and took that important information of how the factories worked in England, brought it to the United States, and with the financing of a local businessman named Moses Brown, constructs Slater's Mill. This leads to the construction of larger factories, particularly financed by the Boston Manufacturing Company and individuals like Francis Cabot Lowell, which, with the Boston Associates, construct manufacturing cities such as Lawrence, Massachusetts, and also Lowell, Massachusetts, the Lowell Mills being very famous for its textile production on the banks of the Merrimack River. Many of the workers being the Lowell Mill Girls, who eventually will form their own newspaper and also a primitive union to engage in collective bargaining, and other towns become mill towns across the Midwest and also New England, including my hometown of Amesbury, Massachusetts, in which these mills produce nails, and hats in its early days along the banks of the Powwow River. Very significant Supreme Court case involving manufacturing occurs in 1842 with the case of Commonwealth v. Hunt. In this case, for the first time, the Supreme Court acknowledged the right of a union to exist and collectively bargain. The legality of labor unions prior to this was quite uncertain. However, in 1842, the court rules that combinations or unions that were indeed legal if they are organized for a legal purpose and use legal means. This is really the beginning of labor conflict in the United States and the emergence of labor unions, which will become so significant later on. Women also play a new role in this age of manufacturing in the sense that they would participate in domestic manufactures, these cottage industries. And now with males, husbands often leaving the home, not necessarily to work on the farm, but rather to go to a local mill or a factory, we see the emergence of what is often called a cult of domesticity in the antebellum period, which celebrated the father as the breadwinner who would go to work and bring money home to provide for housing and food for the family, and the wife as the mother, who would also play a very important role in teaching the children religion and also education. Women during the antebellum period enjoy a legal status also known as the femme couverte, or covered woman, in which she had little legal identity on her own, but rather was under the legal coverage of her husband. In some states, women were not allowed to own property. They were not allowed to inherit their husband's possessions or lands upon the death of their husbands. And in many states, they are not allowed to initiate a divorce, and there are no domestic battery laws as well. Of course, the feminist movement will become significant in changing much of these femme covert statuses in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century. Very important invention during this age of manufacturing was by Eli Whitney. Eli Whitney was a tutor and a manufacturer of nails in Connecticut. And so he uses that, his experience and his background to produce probably the most significant invention of the early antebellum period, which is the cotton gin or cotton engine, which would remove the seeds from the very sticky strands of long staple cotton, and thus making cotton a very valuable product, easy to grow, and then a very desired substance for textile manufacturers. This leads to an explosion of slavery and the demand of slaves, and the emergence of very large plantations, particularly in the South, driven by slave labor for the production of cotton. Cotton becomes king cotton in the South, and a very valuable crop all the way up throughout the 19th century. Eli Whitney is also responsible for a very important invention as well in the development of interchangeable parts. Before Eli Whitney's interchangeable parts, all manufacturers were custom made. With the development of interchangeable parts, it makes it much easier to repair an item and by streamlining the manufacturing process. Other important antebellum inventors include Isaac Singer, who was instrumental in developing the sewing machine, John Deere, whose first major invention was the development of a deep steel plow, which could turn over the soil at a much deeper level and thus provide greater nourishment for crops and greater crop yields. This is very significant, particularly with the farming of Kentucky bluegrass country. Also, Cyrus McCormick, who is going to be the founder of International Harvester, is the inventor of the mechanical reaper, which is a machine that accelerated the harvesting of crops with this carriage and scythe mechanism pulled behind horses. Samuel F.B. Morse, who invents the telegraph and also its requisite Morse code, and also the laying of the transatlantic cable, a cable that goes under the ocean and connects the United States to Europe, thus increasing communication between the old world and the new. Charles Goodyear, who is responsible for the development of vulcanized rubber. Thus, we can see the creation of the patent office in the United States because so many patents and so many entrepreneurs and inventors are developing so many key items during this age of manufacturing. I think this painting by William Walker in 1883 really reflects the changes in the American economy in the early antebellum period. We see a large-scale plantation that is driven by slave labor, large cotton production, but we also see a mill and also a steamship in the background. So we see the convergence between industrialism, but also agriculture, the mixing of these two worlds, which of course will lead to conflict regarding what is the economic vision for the United States, and then of course eventually the greatest conflict of all over the issue of slavery in the coming of the American Civil War in 1861.